Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anita Bhela from the University of Delhi, and today we will be discussing Aristotle's Poetics. This module has been divided into two sections, Module 2 and 3. The first one is an analysis of poetry, and the second one deals with tragedy. So kindly read the two in conjunction. In the first module that we are going to do today, it will be an analysis of poetry. We will be studying Aristotle's views on poetry and on the art of poetry and the manner and method of judging poetry. Aristotle, as you all know, was a Greek philosopher. He was born in 384 BCE. Why BCE? Because nowadays BC and AD have been replaced by BCE and CE. BCE refers to before common era or current era, and CE is common era. Not everybody follows this, but it's generally considered to be more secular. Aristotle was a philosopher, a poet, a writer. Now, the word Aristotle itself means the best purpose. He was born in an affluent family. His father was the personal physician to King Macedon and had the privilege of moving around in the royal palace. Aristotle was the pupil of Plato. He joined Plato's academy at the age of 18. And later on, he became the tutor of Alexander the Great. Later on in his life, he established his own academy at Athens and delivered lectures to his students. We do not have his actual writings, but only the notes which his students had taken or written down. And it's only from these that we get an idea of what Aristotle thought and believed and propagated. Although we have a lot of his views on poetry and poets, and yet there is very little that we know about his views on comedy, because not much has survived. Regarding his family life, he married Pythias and had a daughter from her, whom he also named Pythias Jr. Later, after the death of his wife, he remarried, and his wife bore him a son whom he called Nicomachus. He was named after his father. As I told you earlier, that he was the tutor of Alexander the Great, but later he fell out with Alexander, and when there was an anti-Macedonian sentiment, he had to flee to his mother's place. Later, in 322, he died in Euboea of natural causes. Most of Aristotle's works were composed while he was in his academy at Athens. He was a very learned man. He had an amazing passion for learning, for acquiring knowledge. He had read astronomy, geography, meteorology, anatomy, zoology, and various other disciplines. Most of his work can be found in Nicomachecs, metaphysics. He wrote these treatises: metaphysics, Nicomachean ethics, politics, and of course, what we are going to discuss today, poetics. In fact, his knowledge was so great that we could say that he was an encyclopedia of knowledge. And critics like Penny consider him the first genuine scientist. What is Poetics? Poetics is a 26-chapter treatise, and it deals with poetry and the art of writing poetry, on Aristotle's ideas of imitation, the nature of imitation, and also it deals with how to judge and evaluate poetry and how to write good poetry. Here I would like to explain that poetry was used in a very broad sense by Aristotle. It included drama, it included certain types of music also. Just as in Bharat's Natya Shastra, you have what the idea of Natya, that is, but it's not only drama. The principles of Bharat's Natya Shastra apply to all the arts, to painting, to dance, to music, to drama itself, various types of drama, and even to architecture. The Poetics has been and continues to be a very important document which has served the interests of aesthetics for many years and centuries. It was first discovered in translation during the Renaissance, and from then onwards, literary critics have always turned to it, either to agree with it or to disagree with it. Later on, Sidney approved all the unities that Aristotle had talked about. But later, Johnson disagreed with him and said that certain unities were not necessary. Whether for agreement or disagreement, critics always go back to Aristotle. His idea of action in tragedy or in epic has been approved by most critics. Aristotle just does not make statements. He tries to corroborate everything that he says through examples and through actual reference to some poets and artists. The most important thing that Aristotle said was concerning mimesis or imitation. He tells us that how does a child learn? The child learns right from its birth through the act of imitation. He or she tries to imitate the actions and words that are spoken by those around him. So, imitation is ingrained within us. And this imitation, of course, has to be used creatively and intellectually by the imaginative artist. What the artist does is that he can take an action as it is, or he may think of an action as he thinks it is, or he may think of an action as it ought to be. And then on that basis, he can recreate and imitate life. But through his creativity, he can add much to it. In Aristotle's views, life can be duplicated or imitated, or the action of mimesis can take place through the imitation of character or emotion or even of action. Poetry attempts to imitate life through rhythm, language, and harmony. The poet's art is the result of his observance of life. He may observe life in a subjective manner, or he may observe it in an objective manner by standing apart, or he may also observe it by assuming another persona and watching it totally objectively. And the kind of poetry that the artist or the poet produces depends on what is the nature of the imitation. The nature of imitation depends upon the object, mode, medium of imitation. Object of imitation. The major object of imitation is men in action. Art imitates life by presenting men as better than they are in life with sublime qualities, or as true to life as they are, or worse than they are with low morals. It is the real skill of the poet that enables him to represent men of different kinds in a different way, yet they seem to be true to life. The medium of imitation. A poet may represent life through rhythm, language, or harmony. Music is the example of imitation of life through rhythm and harmony. Dancing imitates character, emotion, and action through its rhythmical movements. Verse poetry is an example of imitation of life through language. This includes epic poetry, tragedy, comedy, dithyrambic poetry, and even to some extent, music. In this process of imitation, if the artist makes a factual error, then it completely mars the presentation or the imitation. The work is completely destroyed through that error which the poet or the artist makes. Aristotle classifies different types of poetry on the basis of the nature of imitation. He talks about the object, the medium, and the mode of imitation. In case the imitation is of noble qualities and of noble action, then he calls it epic or tragedy. In case it is an imitation of men of lower qualities and lower action, then he calls it satire or comedy. The pleasure that we receive from epic or tragedy and that which we receive from satire or comedy depends on different things. In epic and tragedy, many times we identify with the hero, and this identification gives us pleasure and happiness. On the other hand, when we see characters who are lower and whose actions are lower, we think that we are not them, and therefore it gives us pleasure as well, because we think we are better. Epic poetry and tragedy have a number of similarities and also a number of dissimilarities. First, we will do the similarities. What are the similarities between epic poetry and tragedy? Both attempt to imitate men in noble action. Both have unity of plot. Both can use the same subject matter for mimesis. Both can be either simple or complex, and both have all the 6 elements common to them, including peripegia and anagnorisis. Both deal with great and noble deeds, noble actions, and suffering. all the elements of epic are present in tragedy, but all the elements of tragedy are not present in epic. Although there is so much similarity between the two, yet there are some differences. So, what are the differences between epic poetry and tragedy? For epic poetry, the medium is language, whereas for tragedy, it is action. The epic is in verse form, tragedy is in dramatic form. Epic is narrated. Tragedy is performed. Epic is confined to 1 meter, that is the hexameter. On the other hand, in tragedy, you may use different kinds of meters to reflect the language and status of the different characters. But the generally used meter is the iambic. Epic uses the device of the imagination for its effect, whereas tragedy uses music and spectacle. The action in epic poetry has no time limit. On the other hand, action in tragedy is confined to a single day. This is what Aristotle calls the unity of time. It should be confined to a single revolution of the sun so that people can believe that it's actually happening while they are watching it. The content of an epic can be longer and more complex, and it can deal with more fantastic events. But since tragedy is meant to be watched, to be seen, therefore Aristotle thinks these elements cannot be used in tragedy. In an epic, many incidents can take place in different places at different times, and the epic poet can keep moving back and forth between them. But tragedy has to be more focused, and it has to take place at one place. Why? Because the audience must believe in the possibility of the actions taking place. To understand the epic, you only need the imagination. But to understand tragedy, to appreciate it, the tragic poet uses music and spectacle, which adds to the appreciation. The epic is generally lengthy, and therefore it is not possible to appreciate it in one sitting. Whereas tragedy, because you watch it at one go, you can appreciate it in a single setting. There is no time limit to the action set for an epic, but as we said earlier, that the action of tragedy has to be confined to a single day. The pleasure that we derive from epic is based on our imagination. But the aesthetic pleasure which we derive from tragedy is based on what Aristotle called catharsis. Catharsis is the purging of the emotions. For tragedy especially, he says it is the purgation of the emotions of pity and fear. More details about catharsis will be done in the next module when we deal with tragedy. Generally, critics consider the epic superior to tragedy. But Aristotle does not agree with them. Why do they put it at a higher level because they think that whereas the epic is meant for a higher level of people, tragedy is meant for the lower classes because it is performed and they can easily understand it. Aristotle talks of the superiority of tragedy over epic, whereas the critics have always placed the epic above the tragedy. Why? Because they think that the epic is more difficult to understand. It needs a higher level of imagination and a greater level of comprehension because it is narrated. But Aristotle disagrees with the critics. Aristotle establishes tragedy as the superior art form over epic. And he talks about the following specialities that exist in tragedy. One is that tragedy has everything that an epic has. So how can the epic be more superior? The additional elements, music and spectacle in tragedy, enable the audience to enjoy and appreciate tragedy, providing an indulgent pleasure. Tragedy can easily be enjoyed in a single setting if it is presented in a convincing manner and shows its closeness to life. And the most important effect which Aristotle talks about, which is present in tragedy but not in the epic, is the cathartic effect. Catharsis is a medical term meaning purging, and it leads to the purging of the emotions in tragedy of pity and fear, or pity and awe. Why is catharsis important? It is important because it relieves us of our own feelings of anger or pity or fear through the vicarious pleasure that we get in watching some of the actions related to this. Aristotle's concept of comedy, as I said earlier, we do not have much information about Aristotle's writings on comedies because all we have is the notes which his pupils took, and not much of comedy is revealed there. Comedy too is an imitation. It is the imitation of the lower actions of lower people. Of course, it does not imitate ugliness, but only imitates the weaknesses and defects of the lower characters. The idea is not to instill pain, but to show the ludicrousness of some of the actions. But when we watch comedy, we do not identify with the characters as we do with the tragic characters. But we do get pleasure and happiness out of it because we think that we are better than the characters that are being portrayed. Before we conclude, let us see what is Aristotle's contribution to aesthetic beliefs or aesthetic ideas or literary theories. His most important contribution is that he went against what Plato had to say about poetry and poets. Plato banished poets from his idealist state. Why did he do this? He admired Homer, and as Sidney later tells us, in fact, Plato used poetry in his own dialogues. So why did he condemn it? He condemned it because he thought that it rouses passions and does not direct us to be in control of them. Aristotle refuted Plato, his own teacher, and told us that poetry is useful and can be good. And his Poetics then goes on, as we have said earlier, to deal with the art of poetry, of the art of judging and evaluating poetry, and of telling us the idea of mimesis or imitation and the different types of imitation according to which poetry can be classified. Let us sum up. The first chapters of Poetics deal with the art of creating poetry. Aristotle defines poetry as mimesis or the art of imitation. He says the imitation has to be of actions from real life. They should be within the realm of probability. And high poetry deals with men of noble. High poetry deals with imitation of the actions of noble men. And if it deals with the noble deeds and noble actions of noble men, then it becomes epic or tragedy, which he considers superior forms of poetry. On the other hand, if the imitation is of men of lower qualities and lower actions, then we call it comedy or satire. All kinds of poetic compositions give us pleasure, be it tragedy, be it epic, be it comedy, or be it satire. The aesthetic principle of pleasure is important to all modes of imitation. Of course, according to Aristotle, the quality of the poetry depends upon the kind of imitation that takes place. It depends on the mode, the object, and medium of the imitation. The imitation should be as close to life as possible. The imitation should imitate life as it is, as we think it is, or as it ought to be, but should always remain within the realm of probability. Any error in this act of imitation can lead to marring the work. Later, Aristotle distinguishes between epic and tragedy. He tells us that there are many similarities, but there are also certain dissimilarities. And he places tragedy over the epic, going against the established norms. Whatever the art form, be it epic, tragedy, comedy, or satire, Aristotle tells us that it must give aesthetic pleasure. The aesthetic pleasure that is to be derived from either reading narrative epics, watching a tragic performance, or a comedy, or reading or watching satirical presentation, we must always receive aesthetic pleasure. The aesthetic pleasure that we receive from tragedy, and which he believes is the highest, he calls catharsis. We will be dealing more with the different elements of tragedy, what constitutes tragedy, in the next module. And for this particular module on an analysis of poetry, please read the e-text. Thank you.